in pure Borges fashion, now he's dumping all kinds of stuff in there. Borges's mind is filled with all the mythologies, all the sagas, all the epics, all the plays, poems, novels, short stories of the world. And he does such a great job in his short fiction, just picking and choosing and making this sort of conglomeration from his smorgasbord of knowledge. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. I am going to read through this delightful little short story by Borges called Shakespeare's Memory. It's one of my favorites. And I'm going to also offer commentary throughout. And the purpose is something akin to what I did way back in my In a Tub by Amy Hempel analysis video. In that video, I was trying to show sort of what goes through my mind or what I think about as I read a story. And in that video, I actually did annotations, literally writing in my book in real time. This time I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to sort of talk out loud. But the target audience for this video would be anyone who's interested in what happens in my mind when I'm reading a story. It addresses a lot of questions I get about how to be a better reader, what goes through your mind when you read, what do you choose to annotate, what do you chase down before moving on in a story, why should I reread, things like that. I should make it clear that I didn't choose this story because it's difficult. Quite the opposite, I'd say. Borges is very exceptional in his ability, like Stephen Hawking, to take very complex ideas and present them in such an accessible and entertaining and engrossing way. Shakespeare's Memory is not something that I'm trying to thoroughly and exhaustively annotate for you. I'm not going to dig into these, 7 layers of meaning or try to present this big web of interconnected ideas and names, people, places, so on. Rather, the idea is to try to impart a sense of what I mean when I say a reader of fiction. What is it that I'm so attracted to in a story like this? Why does this story tickle my reader's heart? As I read through this and comment on it, I will address you as if you aren't a PhD in comparative literature, maybe not even a bachelor's degree in English or some type of literature, but rather someone who's just interested in literary fiction and drawn to someone like Borges. Like most Borges stories, it's made to be enjoyed again and again, to get richer with each read. And so because of that, I'm going to deliberately pass by a lot of different things that he inserts in there for us to find on rereads or to puzzle over on the first read. So if you find yourself reading something and it sort of puzzles you and it's just your first or second read, just kind of take that with you. And you don't have to sit there with it and ruminate on it for too long. It'll become clear. But all that to say, if something does puzzle you, it's probably because it's deliberately put there as a piece of a puzzle. And also ask questions of things that puzzle you. Ask questions, for example, why it is that the narrator turns specifically to Bach at the end as his solution. All I'll say is that there are at least 3 to 5 clever winks that Borges puts in just the first half of the story, and that I won't cover in this video. In any case, I hope you find this video useful. Shakespeare's Memory by Borges. There are devotees of Goethe, of the Edda, of the late song of the Nibelungen. My fate has been Shakespeare. So already in the first sentence, someone like me, I'm a sucker. He throws in the name of Goethe, the juggernaut of German letters, the Edda, which is, of course, you've got the prose Edda and the poetic Edda. These are from, I'll get this wrong, Snorri Sturluson or something like that. And there's 2 S's, and Snorri is one of them. Snorri Sturluson. And these are the great Icelandic or Norse sagas, mythologies, and then the late song of the Nibelungen. This is Germanic mythology that has really been popularized by Wagner's Ring cycle. And then he lands on My fate has been Shakespeare. So already in one sentence, he's evoked these pillars of the Western literary traditions. But then he says, not my favorite has been Shakespeare, but my fate. So already he has hooked all of us bookworms. He has expressed that the speaker, the narrator, who's in the first person, is someone who is deeply invested in literary studies. And he's given us a little bit of a mystery. Is he just being cheeky or funny by saying my fate has been Shakespeare? Like, haha, that's funny, a good scholar's joke. Or is there really something pernicious that has happened? We move on. He says, my fate has been Shakespeare. As it still is, though in a way that no one could have foreseen. No one save one man, Daniel Thorp, who just recently died in Pretoria. There is another man, too, whose face I have never seen. All right, so what do we have? 3 sentences for the opening paragraph. And the first time I read this, as every time I've read it, I'm completely sold. I have to read this story to the end, not only because this is one of my favorite characters, that being someone whose head is overstuffed with literature, but also what are these ominous signposts or foreshadowings? My fate has been Shakespeare, and it still is, though in a way no one could have foreseen. What does that mean? And then the plot continues to thicken in a mere 3 sentences. No one save one man, Daniel Thorp. Okay, so we're going to learn about who this curious Daniel Thorp fellow is. Oh, he recently died. And then, as if he hasn't given us enough in 2 sentences, Borges gives us the ultimate hook. There is another man, too, whose face I have never seen. So there's the opening paragraph. Now he switches to exposition. My name is Hermann Sorgel. The curious reader may have chanced to leaf through my Shakespeare chronology, which I once considered essential to a proper understanding of the texts. I love this proud literary scholar. It was translated into several languages, including Spanish. Nor is it beyond the realm of possibility that the reader will recall a protracted diatribe against an emendation Theobald inserted into his critical edition of 1734. An emendation which became from that moment on an unquestioned part of the canon. Today, I am a little taken aback by the uncivil tone of those pages of mine, which I might almost say were written by another man. In 1914, I drafted, but did not publish, an article on the compound words that the Hellenist and dramatist George Chapman coined for his versions of Homer. In forging these terms, Chapman did not realize that he had carried English back to its Anglo-Saxon origins, the Ursprung of the language. And Ursprung there is italicized to make sure we know that this is a foreign language. Already, it doesn't matter if you're grasping all these names. And clearly some of this stuff is made up. This is a fictional character who is a scholar and has written this Shakespeare chronology. What matters is that Borges is doing such a great job of imparting the tone and demeanor and stature of this character as someone who is clearly a gifted and somewhat renowned scholar with serious ideas and investment in the likes of Homer and Shakespeare studies. It never occurred to me then that Chapman's voice, which I have now forgotten, might one day be so familiar to me. Interesting. A scattering of critical and philological notes, as they are called, signed with my initials, complete, I believe, my literary biography. Although perhaps I might also be permitted to include an unpublished translation of Macbeth, which I began in order to distract my mind from the death of my brother, Otto Julius, who fell on the Western Front in 1917. I never finished translating the play. I came to realize that English has, to its credit, 2 registers, the Germanic and the Latinate, while our own German, in spite of its greater musicality, must content itself with one. Okay, so this is a German scholar, as if we didn't get that from his love of Goethe and the Nibelungen, and of course his name, Hermann Sorgel. Now we know for sure that this is someone who's actually not American, as a reader such as I would kind of default to, or knowing that Borges is Argentine, think that it's an Argentine or some kind of Spanish descent. But now we know that in addition, this is someone who is also deeply rooted in philology, or the study of words and the meanings of words, etymology, and so on. I mentioned Daniel Thorp. I was introduced to Thorp by Major Barclay at a Shakespeare conference. Of course, he's probably been to every Shakespeare conference in his lifetime. I will not say where or when. I know all too well that such specifics are in fact vaguenesses. More important than Daniel Thorp's face, which my partial blindness helps me to forget, was his notorious lucklessness, and of course a partial blindness. Blindness is all through literature, including Homer himself being cited as being blind, Milton, whom I covered not too long ago, and then of course Borges himself. When a man reaches a certain age, there are many things he can simulate. Happiness is not one of them. Daniel Thorp gave off an almost physical air of melancholy. What a wonderful aphoristic statement that's just pure Borges. When a man reaches a certain age, there are many things he can simulate. Happiness is not one of them. And it works so well with this character because we get a sense of that sort of crotchety, ornery, older scholar. And you can almost feel the sense of his being left behind by people who don't study the classics, who don't share his views on Shakespeare and so on. After a long session, night found us in a pub, an undistinguished place that might have been any pub in London. To make ourselves feel that we were in England, which of course we were, we drained many a ritual pewter mug of dark, warm beer. "In Punjab," said the Major in the course of our conversation, "a fellow once pointed out a beggar to me. Islamic legend apparently has it, you know, that King Solomon owned a ring that allowed him to understand the language of the birds. And this particular beggar, so everyone believed, had somehow come into possession of that ring. The value of the thing was so beyond all reckoning that the poor bugger could never sell it, and he died in one of the courtyards of the mosque of Wazir Khan in Lahore." It occurred to me that Chaucer must have been familiar with the tale of that miraculous ring, but mentioning it would have spoiled Barclay's anecdote. "And what became of the ring?" I asked. "Lost now, of course, as that sort of magical thingamajig always is. Probably in some secret hiding place in the mosque, or on the finger of some chap who's off living somewhere where there's no birds." "Or where there are so many," I noted, "that one can't make out what they're saying for the racket." Your story has something of the parable about it, Barclay. And the first time I read this, I didn't realize how much foreshadowing was in that statement. But notice that in pure Borges fashion, now he's dumping all kinds of stuff in there. Borges's mind is filled with all the mythologies, all the sagas, all the epics, all the plays, poems, novels, short stories of the world. And he does such a great job in his short fiction, just picking and choosing and making this sort of conglomeration from his smorgasbord of knowledge. And so now he's dropping in the idea that there's this ring that is from some Islamic tradition that King Solomon had and has been passed down. And whereas the guy telling this anecdote, Major Barclay, is thinking to himself, oh my goodness, if I could suddenly understand what all the birds are saying, I would go somewhere where there aren't any birds because that would drive me crazy. Our narrator, however, Hermann Sorgel, says, or where there are so many that one can't make out what they're saying for the racket. Your story has something of the parable about it. So his scholar's mind is thinking more in terms of, if I had this ability, I would stay put for a while. It was at that point that Daniel Thorp spoke up. He spoke somehow impersonally, without looking at us. His English had a peculiar accent which I attributed to a long stay in the East. "It is not a parable," he said, "or if it is nonetheless a true story. There are things that have a price so high they can never be sold." The words I am attempting to reconstruct impressed me less than the conviction with which Daniel Thorp spoke them. We thought he was going to say something further, but suddenly he fell mute, as though he regretted having spoken at all. Barclay said good night. Thorp and I returned together to the hotel. It was quite late by now, but Thorp suggested we continue our conversation in his room. After a short exchange of trivialities, he said to me, "Would you like to own King Solomon's ring? I offer it to you." That's a metaphor, of course, but the thing the metaphor stands for is every bit as wondrous as the ring. Shakespeare's memory, from his youngest boyhood days to early April 1616. I offer it to you. Now, what do you think would go through such a devoted, committed Shakespearean scholar's mind where he offered Shakespeare's memory from his earliest boyhood to the year of his death? Well, this is how Borges describes what happens when Sorgel is presented with this. I could not get a single word out. It was as though I had been offered the ocean. Thorp went on, "I am not an impostor. I am not insane. I beg you to suspend judgment until you hear me out. Major Barclay no doubt told you that I am, or was, a military physician. The story can be told very briefly. It begins in the East, in a field hospital at dawn. The exact date is not important. An enlisted man named Adam Clay, who had been shot twice, offered me the precious memory, almost literally with his last breath. Pain and fever, as you know, make us creative. I accepted his offer without crediting it. Besides, after a battle, nothing seems so very strange. He barely had time to explain the singular conditions of the gift. The one who possesses it must offer it aloud, and the one who is to receive it must accept it the same way. The man who gives it loses it forever." The name of the soldier in the pathetic scene of the bestowal struck me as literary, in the worst sense of the word. It made me somewhat leery. "And you now possess Shakespeare's memory?" "What I possess," Thorp answered, "are still two memories. My own personal memory, and the memory of the Shakespeare that I partially am. Or rather, two memories possess me. There is a place where they merge somehow. There is a woman's face. I am not sure what century it belongs to." "And the memory that was Shakespeare's?" I asked. "What have you done with it?" There was a silence. "I have written a fictionalized biography," he said at last, "which garnered the contempt of critics but won some small commercial successes in the United States and the colonies. I believe that's all. I have warned you that my gift is not a sinecure. I am still waiting for your answer." I sat thinking. Had I not spent a lifetime, however colorless and ordinary, in pursuit of Shakespeare? Was it not fair that, at the end of my labors, I find him? I said, carefully pronouncing each word, "I accept Shakespeare's memory." Now, what's so amazing is that through Thorp, Borges has confronted us with the supreme dilemma that is at hand here in just such succinct fashion. What I possess are still two memories, my own personal memory and the memory of the Shakespeare that I partially am. Or rather, the two memories possess me. There is a place where they merge, somehow. Now, when I first read this, and you get to the part where you realize that the title of the piece literally refers to someone being able to bestow upon you the memory of the man Shakespeare, I automatically view it as, oh, that would be incredible. I view it as something that would be discrete and detached, almost as if you picture it in some isolated database in your mind that you can access with queries such as, did you really write all of those works that we attribute to you? And it'll just come back, yes or no. Or I wrote Hamlet, Macbeth, Lear, blah, 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 but Francis Bacon wrote these, or my sister wrote those. But Borges is smarter than that. Borges has thought more deeply about what it would mean to possess someone's memory. And he's just dropped that little thought in there via Thorp. But of course, our narrator is so enticed at the idea that he can't help but accept. Plus, it doesn't really say how many of those pewter glasses of dark, warm beer they've actually had. Something happened. Of that, there is no doubt. But I did not feel it happen. Maybe just a slight sense of fatigue, perhaps imaginary. I clearly recall that Thorp did tell me, "The memory has entered your mind, but it must be discovered. It will emerge in dreams or when you are awake, when you turn the pages of a book or turn a corner. Don't be impatient. Don't invent recollections. Chance, in its mysterious workings, may help you along, or it may hold you back. As I gradually forget, you will remember. I cannot tell you how long the process will take." So basically, it's going to be through Proustian memory or involuntary memory that the strands of Shakespeare's memory will be stirred and come to the forefront of the mind. Already, I hope you get a sense of how enticing this Borges story is. Borges, he is the master of presenting an idea or a scenario, a case, a dilemma that, at least for me, I get so excited about seeing how he's going to show where this goes, how he's going to describe it. How is Borges going to handle describing and writing the idea of someone possessing, taking in Shakespeare's memory, and furthermore, discovering it, Proustian style? We dedicated what remained of the night to a discussion of the character of Shylock. I refrained from trying to discover whether Shakespeare had had personal dealings with Jews. I did not want Thorp to imagine that I was putting him to some sort of test. I did discover, whether with relief or uneasiness I cannot say, that his opinions were as academic and conventional as my own. In spite of that long night without sleep, I hardly slept at all the following night. I found, as I had so many times before, that I was a coward. Out of fear of disappointment, I could not deliver myself up to open-handed hope. I preferred to think that Thorp's gift was illusory, but hope did, irresistibly, come to prevail. I would possess Shakespeare and possess him as no one had ever possessed anyone before, not in love or friendship or even hatred. I, in some way, would be Shakespeare. So this is the idea that if we take on someone's memories, in a way, we're taking on their consciousness. And if we're taking on their consciousness, then that's pretty much how we get our sense of identity. So now, little by little, he's going to be two men, two identities, but again, not clearly delineated. Not that I would write the tragedies or the intricate sonnets, but I would recall the instant at which the witches, who are also the fates, had been revealed to me, the other instant at which I had been given the vast lines, and shake the yoke of inauspicious stars from this world-wearied flesh. I would remember Anne Hathaway as I remembered that mature woman who taught me the ways of love in an apartment in Lubeck so many years ago. I tried to recall that woman, but I could only recover the wallpaper, which was yellow. Did Charlotte Perkins Gilman write the yellow wallpaper before this was written? Yes. Maybe that's an allusion there. And the light that streamed in through the window. This first failure might have foreshadowed those to come. So again, we've got more failures to come here, as we pretty much suspected. I had hypothesized that the images of that wondrous memory would be primarily visual. Such was not the case. Days later, as I was shaving, I spoke into the mirror a string of words that puzzled me. A colleague informed me that they were from Chaucer's ABC. One afternoon, as I was leaving the British Museum, I began whistling a very simple melody that I had not heard before. The reader will surely have noted the common thread that links these first revelations of the memory. It was, despite the splendor of some metaphors, a good deal more auditory than visual. So Borges has thought through the fact that Shakespeare, being such a gifted poet, probably has a stronger auditory, because he's writing mostly for the theater, spoken poetry, spoken lines, he probably had a much better auditory than visual memory. This is the kind of details that I'm a sucker for writers culling. De Quincey says that a man's brain is a palimpsest. Every new text covers the previous one, and is in turn covered by the text that follows. But all-powerful memory, capital M, is able to exhume any impression, no matter how momentary it might have been, if given sufficient stimulus. To judge by the will he left, there was not a single book in Shakespeare's house, not even the Bible, and yet everyone is familiar with the books he so often repaired to. Chaucer, Gower, Spenser, Christopher Marlowe, Holinshed's Chronicles, Florio's Montaigne, North's Plutarch. I possessed, at least potentially, the memory that had been Shakespeare's. The reading, which is to say the rereading of those old volumes, would be the stimulus I sought. So I love this. Of course, a bookworm like Borges is going to think through, and of course transmuted through a scholar, a literary scholar. He gets the idea that, oh, I can stimulate the dormant or latent Shakespearean memory that I now possess by going and reading the books that Shakespeare read. It's brilliant. And it's a lot of what we've talked about recently in the Why Do We Read Fiction series, about how our memories are so tightly coupled with what we have read. I also reread the sonnets, which are his works of greatest immediacy. Once in a while, I came up with the explication, or with many explications. Good lines demand to be read aloud. After a few days, I had effortlessly recovered the harsh R's and open vowels of the 16th century. So pronunciation from memory, that auditory memory, is starting to come through Shakespeare's memories. In an article I published in the, and I apologize for my poor German pronunciations here, Zeitschrift für Germanische Philologie, I wrote that sonnet 127 referred to the memorable defeat of the Spanish Armada. I had forgotten that Samuel Butler advanced the same thesis in 1899. A visit to Stratford-upon-Avon was, predictably enough, sterile. Then came the gradual transformation of my dreams. I was to be granted neither splendid nightmares a la De Quincey, nor pious allegorical visions in the manner of his master Jean-Paul. It was unknown rooms and faces that entered my nights. The first face I identified was Chapman's. Later, there was Ben Jonson's, and the face of one of the poet's neighbors, a person who does not figure in the biographies, but whom Shakespeare often saw. The man who acquires an encyclopedia does not thereby acquire every line, every paragraph, every page, and every illustration. He acquires the possibility of becoming familiar with one and another of those things. This is exactly how memory works. It's brilliant. And what I said earlier about when I first read this, I imagined possessing Shakespeare's memory as possessing a sort of database, a complete and indexed database that I could query at will. Borges is basically saying the same thing, except Borges, of course, isn't thinking about databases as a reader of today would. He's thinking about an encyclopedia, which itself is a database. If that is the case with a concrete and relatively simple entity, given, I mean, the alphabetical order of its parts, etc., then what must happen with a thing that is abstract and variable, ondoyant et divers, a dead man's magical memory, for example? That's just such a brilliant way of comparing the encyclopedia or database to someone's memory, the way that it would come complete. And what he means by a relatively simple entity, given, I mean, the alphabetical order of its parts, that would be indexing, meaning it's arranged to be searched very easily. And he's comparing that against the abstract and variable fluidity of memory, which is something that would need machine learning or fuzzy search in today's terms. No one may capture in a single instant the fullness of his entire past. That gift was never granted even to Shakespeare, as far as I know, much less to me, who was but his partial heir. A man's memory is not a summation. It is a chaos of vague possibilities. St. Augustine, if I am not mistaken, speaks of the palaces and the caverns of memory. The second metaphor is the more fitting one. It was into those caverns that I descended. Like our own, Shakespeare's memory included regions, broad regions of shadow, regions that he willfully shunned. It was not without shock that I remembered how Ben Jonson had made him recite Latin and Greek hexameters, and how his ear, the incomparable ear of Shakespeare, would go astray in many of them, to the hilarity of his fellows. And that is alluding to a well-known anecdote about how Shakespeare's grasp of Latin and Greek and more, or his lack thereof, was often ridiculed. I knew states of happiness and of darkness that transcend common human experience. Without my realizing it, long and studious solitude had prepared me for the docile reception of this miracle. After some 30 days, the dead man's memory had come to animate me fully. And we're wondering where we're going to go from here. Well, this is where we're going, all the way. For one curiously happy week, I almost believed myself Shakespeare. His work renewed itself for me. I knew that for Shakespeare, the moon was less the moon than it was Diana, and less Diana than that dark, drawn-out word, moon. I noted another discovery. Shakespeare's apparent instances of inadvertence, those absences dans l'infini, of which Hugo speaks apologetically, were deliberate. Shakespeare tolerated them, or actually interpolated them, so that his discourse, destined for the stage, might appear to be spontaneous and not overly polished and artificial. And then some more German. Nicht allzu glatt und gekünstelt. Not overly polished and artificial. You don't need to know what these things mean. From context, Borges gives them to you. He's just keeping in character with this learned man. The same goal inspired him to mix his metaphors. My way of life is fallen into the sear, the yellow leaf. One morning I perceived a sense of guilt deep within his memory. I did not try to define it. Shakespeare himself had done so for all time. Suffice it to say that the offense had nothing in common with perversion. I realized that the three faculties of the human soul, memory, understanding, and will, are not some mere scholastic fiction. Shakespeare's memory was able to reveal to me only the circumstances of the man Shakespeare. Clearly, these circumstances do not constitute the uniqueness of the poet. What matters is the literature the poet produced with that frail material. This gets at a further level of taxonomy when we try to classify what memory consists of. And here we get the idea that Shakespeare has his memories of Shakespeare as the man, but he has more of a persona as the poet. Where are the dividing lines between, or another way of putting it is, can there be memories that are distinct for Shakespeare the poet versus Shakespeare the man? Borges says no. I was naive enough to contemplate a biography, just as Thorp had. I soon discovered, however, that that literary genre required a talent for writing that I did not possess. I do not know how to tell a story. I do not know how to tell my own story, which is a great deal more extraordinary than Shakespeare's. Besides, such a book would be pointless. Chance or fate dealt Shakespeare those trivial, terrible things that all men know. It was his gift to be able to transmute them into fables, into characters that were much more alive than the gray man who dreamed them, into verses which the generations will never abandon, into verbal music. What purpose would it serve to unravel that wondrous fabric, besiege and mine the tower, reduced to the modest proportions of a documentary biography or a realistic novel, the sound and fury of Macbeth? So we can hear Borges, or rather Hermann Sorgel, saying with a great many people who have said it since and before, that the work is more interesting than the artist. Goethe, as we all know, is Germany's official religion. The worship of Shakespeare, which we profess not without nostalgia, is more private. In England, the official religion is Shakespeare, who is so unlike the English. England's sacred book, however, is the Bible. Throughout the first stage of this adventure, I felt the joy of being Shakespeare. Throughout the last, terror and oppression. At first, the waters of the two memories did not mix. In time, the great torrent of Shakespeare threatened to flood my own modest stream, and very nearly did so. Wonderful how he harkens back to, or extends, or connects back to when he was first presented by Thorp with the idea of possessing Shakespeare's memory, and he said that he felt as if he had been offered the ocean. I noted with some nervousness that I was gradually forgetting the language of my parents. Since personal identity is based on memory, I feared for my sanity. My friends would visit me. I was astonished that they could not see that I was in hell. And indeed, that's it. That really is what it can be like for someone who's in the throes of mental torment, or, mental illness is something that's invisible. I began not to understand the everyday world around me. Die alltägliche Umwelt. One morning I became lost in the welter of great shapes forged in iron, wood, and glass. Shrieks and deafening noises assailed and confused me. It took me some time, it seemed an infinity, to recognize the engines and cars of the Bremen railroad station. Amazing. It's Shakespeare's memory is so taking the forefront that it's almost like one of those books like Mark Twain's The Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, but in reverse, where we're pulling Shakespeare into the 20th century. As the years pass, every man is forced to bear the growing burden of his memory. I staggered beneath the two, which sometimes mingled, my own and the incommunicable others. The wish of all things, Spinoza says, is to continue to be what they are. The stone wishes to be stone, the tiger, tiger, and I wanted to be Hermann Sorgel again. I have forgotten the date on which I decided to free myself. Okay, well, with this chilling line that comes on the very last page, how did he free himself of this? I hit upon the easiest way. I dialed telephone numbers at random. The voice of a child or a woman would answer. I believed it was my duty to respect their vulnerable estates. At last, a man's refined voice answered. Do you, I asked, want Shakespeare's memory? Consider well, it is a solemn thing I offer, as I can attest. An incredulous voice replied, I will take the risk. I accept Shakespeare's memory. I explained the conditions of the gift. Paradoxically, I felt both a nostalgie for the book I should have written, and now never would, and a fear that the guest, the specter, would never abandon me. I hung up the receiver and repeated, like a wish, these resigned words. Simply the thing I am shall make me live. I had invented exercises to awaken the antique memory. I had to seek others to erase it. One of many was the study of the mythology of William Blake, that rebellious disciple of Swedenborg. I found it to be less complex than merely complicated. That and other paths were futile. All led me to Shakespeare. I hit at last upon the only solution that gave hope, courage. Strict, vast music. Bach. P.S. 1924. I am now a man among men. In my waking hours, I am Professor Emeritus Hermann Sorgel. I putter about the card catalog and compose erudite trivialities. But at dawn, I sometimes know that the person dreaming is that other man. Every so often in the evening, I am unsettled by small, fleeting memories that are perhaps authentic. And we're left with that P.S. That last sentence is classic Borges, as if he hasn't given us enough grand ideas of memory and sort of almost creatively challenged to us to think how we would write a story about someone who took on Shakespeare's memory. He now drops in the fact that, look, if you did possess Shakespeare's memory for a while and they were merged and you did in fact figure out a way to transfer it to someone else, the memories as they came to your consciousness while you possessed them would become part of the fabric of your own memories. And so we're left with the fact that, look, you may have passed them on to some stranger over the telephone, but you'll never completely get rid of them. And if we go all the way back to the last sentence of the first paragraph, the third sentence, there is another man too, whose face I have never seen. Well, we know it's not Daniel Thorp, but when we go back and reread this, we realize that we had totally forgotten he said that as a nice hook. Or at least I did the first time I read it. I hope this gives you a sense of not only why I love to read, but why reading Borges' fiction is so enjoyable.